If we encode the developing brain through the body, and that's how it gets encoded. If we have pleasurable sensory stimuli, then that's the brain engrams, the templates that will be stored. If they are painful, they're going to be images of pain. And pain evokes violent responses. But there's something else that evokes violent responses, and that's the absence of pleasure. And that's really different than the sensory event of pain, and most people don't really yet appreciate that distinction. And in fact, more damage occurs with the sensory deprivation of pleasure than the actual experiencing of physical painful trauma, which in fact can be handled quite well in individuals who are brought up with a great deal of physical, affectional bonding and pleasure, which carries with it emotional trust and security and so forth. So we really have to look at the trauma of sensory deprivation of physical pleasure. And that translates into the separation experiences, the isolation experiences of the infant from the mother. That's the beginning.
Some of these children at Löhe House Institution in Munich have suffered brain damage. Some are mentally retarded. All have suffered the effects of disrupted maternal-infant relationship. The effects of early separation from their mothers upon children were noted in scientific publications some 25 years ago, when psychiatrist Renee Spitz observed a high frequency of retarded development among institutionalized children. The English psychiatrist John Bowlby created controversy in 1944 with his conclusion that early separation leads to a character disorder marked by a lack of affection or feelings for anyone. These depressed children might be found in institutions around the world. They are withdrawn. Their pace of development has slowed. They are listless, vacant, unnaturally passive. They have few emotional contacts or relations with others, little spontaneity, no laughter, no tears.
What constitutes sensory deprivation? Because if you live in a culture in which the norm, the cultural norm, is you don't get touched very much, people don't perceive that as deprivation. It's like the converse issue of circumcision or genital mutilation. That is so commonplace in our culture that most people don't look at that as genital mutilation or as torture or as mutilation. It's so commonplace. It's the norm. So that's a very important question. So we have to go outside our own culture to get a different frame of reference, a different bearing, a different standard of what's normal. And not only outside of our own culture, excuse me, but also outside of our own species. And we are primates. And if you take a look at how other primates rear their infants, or even mammals with respect to mothers and their newborns, what do we see? We see an enormous amount of physical body contact. There's no mammal that separates the newborn from its mother at birth or any extended period after that, except the human mammal. Yet we do that routinely and isolate them. That's sensory deprivation. Now let's go to the primates. All you have to do is look at any program involving primates in the wild. And where do you see the infants? They're attached to the body of their mother, and they hang on for dear life as the mother's moving around all the time. Continuous body contact. And that should tell us a lesson, because that becomes the standard and the norm of what brings up responsible for healthy infants. And we, in fact, have demonstrated that experimentally in the laboratory by taking the infants away from their mothers, rearing them in cages by themselves, where they can't touch or have body contact with other animals, not their mother or any other animals. Even in a colony room where they can have social relationships with the other animals by vision and hearing and smell, but no body contact, no touch.
At the Hazleton Laboratories in Falls Church, Virginia, these normal monkeys are being studied and filmed by Dr. James Prescott of the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. Active, curious, and alert, these healthy monkeys have been raised by their mothers. When they are put together in a cage, they react to each other with interest. They are at ease with each other. They play and touch each other freely. When Dr. Prescott separates the monkeys, they resist, holding each other tightly. They maintain body contact and cling to each other even through the wire mesh of their cages. Monkeys raised in isolation behave quite differently. These monkeys were removed from their mothers at birth. They were hand-fed in incubators. They were raised in cages through which they could see, hear, and smell other monkeys, but could not touch or be touched by them. When they are put together, there is no play between them. They seem indifferent to touch. Or they react as though touch is unpleasant and move away from each other. When they are held, the isolation-reared monkeys show signs of great stress, screeching and baring their teeth. The stereotype movements of rocking backwards and forwards over and over again are typical of animals deprived of normal mothering. It is as though the animals attempt to give themselves the touch and motion stimuli they were denied in infancy. Similar behaviors in maternally deprived children, rocking and other stereotype movements, are common symptoms observed in institutionalized children all over the world. Some children who engage in stereotype movement, endlessly repeated, show evidence of brain damage. Stereotypical movements are observed in retarded children as well. All these children have been deprived of normal mothering for one reason or another, and display the same emotional and social impairment and stereotype movements as animals raised in isolation.
The experimental studies involving infant separation of monkeys from their mothers was started by Dr. Harry Harlow, behavioral primatologist, psychologist at the University of Wisconsin, and director of the Regional Primate Center there. And he was attempting to develop a breeding colony for experimental research with these animals. And so he, for whatever reason, decided that it was a good idea to separate the infants from the mothers and rear them in cages by themselves. And it wasn't until some time later that he noticed that these animals were engaged in very emotionally, socially abnormal, bizarre behaviors.
Psychologist Harry Harlow at the University of Wisconsin has long studied the importance of early experience to infant monkeys. Whether the cloth dummy or the wire dummy held bottles of milk, the monkeys preferred their cloth-covered mother substitutes at all times. The isolated monkeys would spend as much as 15 hours a day clinging to their cloth mothers. And this attachment persisted after a separation as long as 2 years. When the cloth mother was removed, the monkeys showed signs of extreme disturbance. But they were calmed and comforted when the mother was returned. The wire substitute, even when it held a bottle, excited no affection in the monkeys. The apparent apathy of this animal and its rocking behavior became an important focus of later studies. Dr. Harlow is still investigating the depression that follows the separation of young monkeys from their mothers. Dr. Harlow says that his work began as a mishap. He was raising single monkeys in separate cages when John Bowlby suggested that he was really raising a laboratory of abnormal monkeys.
And as the animals grew older, they were sexually dysfunctional and they were pathologically violent. They engaged in self-mutilation and essentially homicidal assaults against younger animals and even older animals, juvenile animals who were isolation reared, engaged in behavior that no normal juvenile monkey would do, like attacking a big, huge alpha male. I mean, no juvenile monkey in the right mind does this, but these would. So there's the normal constraints on even normal aggression was gone. Well, when I joined the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, which is one of the institutes, the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland, I was brought on board to create the Developmental Behavioral Biology program to look at brain behavioral studies, the effects of early experiences on brain development and behavior, and to examine what were the most crucial issues, for child health and human development. And one of the issues was child abuse and neglect, the effects of maternal social deprivation, which had occupied developmental psychologists for a long time. But what remained was the enigma of understanding these pathological emotional behaviors and social behaviors of these isolation-reared monkeys. And what caught my attention was the denial of Dr. Harlow that these separation experiences involve sensory deprivation. Now, René Spitz, a psychoanalyst, made the same statement about his studies on infants who were institutionalized or hospitalized, where they received no touching, reared in sterile cribs, no physical contact, but physical care and medical care was more than adequate. And many of these infants would develop depression, profound withdrawal, and some even died. But even René Spitz denied that this involved sensory deprivation. And so these two individuals, in my view, historically misled the entire field for almost a generation. And as a developmental neuropsychologist, I said, this is craziness, this is impossible. The only way an infant communicates with its environment, mother and everyone else, and anything else in the environment, is through our sensory systems. So it has to involve our sensory systems. So the question is, which sensory systems are the most important? Probably the most significant of the primate isolation rearing studies, next to the Harlow's original contributions, was that conducted by Dr. William Mason and Gersh Bergson, Dr. Mason was also in Harlow's laboratory, in which he reared isolation-reared infant monkeys on a swinging mother surrogate, and another group were reared on a stationary mother surrogate. And lo and behold, what happens is that this infant monkey that was sitting on this swinging mother surrogate did not develop any of the emotional, social psychopathologies. There was not the depression, the withdrawal behavior, the autistic-like behaviors, the rocking behaviors, self-stimulation behaviors, nor the pathological violence when they grew up as juveniles and adults. They had no tactile aversion, which the infant monkeys who were reared on the stationary surrogate had developed.
This swinging substitute mother, a bleach bottle covered with furry cloth, was invented for an experiment by Drs. William Mason and Gershon Bergson at the Delta Primate Center in Louisiana. The isolated monkey has known no other mother than this moving surrogate, which rises, falls, and sways in a random way. This isolated monkey has an identical substitute mother, but the mother does not move. At 10 months of age, the monkey raised on a moving mother substitute is given a chance to make close physical contact with a human being. His behavior seems normal. He appears to be curious, bold, and friendly. The monkey raised with a stationary mother behaves in quite a different way. He seems timid, cringing, and apparently unhappy. He appears emotionally disturbed, unsociable, and unresponsive to changes in the environment. Rocking and other abnormal behavior were prevented in the monkey on the swinging surrogate, The monkey on the stationary surrogate displays the familiar stereotyped rocking movements.
So what this study indicated was that another sensory system was of crucial importance, in fact, more important than just touch. And that's the sensory system that mediates motion, movement. And that's the vestibular-cerebellar system. And when you look back on it, and you look at what happens in utero, the dominant sensory system is one of motion, of movement. Of all the 6 sensory systems, the one that's continually being stimulated is the movement, with the mother moving around all day long. Vision, hearing, smell, touch, taste are essentially non-functional. Not entirely, but essentially non-functional. So the continuity, the psychological continuity of this motion, which the fetus is continually developing in contact with its mother, the most important sensory modality is movement. And in many cultures, and ours, this movement stimulation ends. And that has to be sensory deprivation. That's shock. And clearly, it seemed to me that this was a major ingredient to understanding the depression, the alienation, and the violence in human populations that we're seeing in the animals. When I first saw the film study of Dr. Will Mason and Gersh Bergson on the swinging on the surrogate, it opened up a whole new door, because it was very clear that there was a sensory system involved that nobody had talked about or addressed, including Dr. Mason and Dr. Gersh Bergson. They talked about the significance of dynamic social interaction between mother and infant. They came out of a background not of developmental neurobiology and neuropsychology, but of social behavior. And so they described their effects in social terms. And see, this is very important, whether you define and conceptualize a phenomena in social psychological or social psychological terms, or in terms of neurobiological and neuropsychological terms. To me, it meant another sensory system, which was the vestibular-cerebellar system. And it was very clear that that was the sensory system that was responsible, obviously by their own experiments, for the effects that they were getting. And then it became obviously clear that all this stereotypical rocking behavior came from the sensory deprivation of movement. They were trying to get the sensory stimulation that they were deprived of early in life. So when I discovered, through Dr. Mason and Gersh Bergson's study, that the vestibular-cerebellar system played a major role in the regulation of these emotional social behaviors, 2 questions occurred. The first was that clearly the vestibular-cerebellar system must have intimate linkages with the limbic system of the brain, which is the major brain structures that mediate and regulate our emotional behaviors. Peaceful behaviors, violent behaviors, sexual behaviors, the maternal behaviors, and so forth. But at that time, in the scientific literature, there was very little information or support of any kind of major connection between the cerebellum and the limbic system's structures of the brain. So I had started out a program of research to, one, document that this kind of isolation varying, the sensory deprivation, what I call somatosensory affectional deprivation, or SAD, does result in abnormal development of the brain, structurally and functionally. And that was what was responsible for the abnormal behaviors. And then secondly, the second neurobiological question was that there is an intimate relationship and structural relationship between the cerebellum and limbic system, which really had not been previously suggested, let alone established in the scientific literature. So the brain studies I initiated documented both. That in fact, the brains of the adult pathological isolation reared monkeys were indeed abnormal. They had deep electrical voltage discharges in the limbic system and the cerebellum. And it's these high voltage discharges, electrical storms, which we call spiking, which we know is associated with explosive outbursts of violence and temporal lobe epilepsy in human patients. So that linkage was established, and these studies were essentially carried out by Dr. Robert Heath and Dr. Bernd Salzberg at the Tulane University Medical School, Department of Psychiatry and Neurology.
At the Tulane University Medical School in New Orleans, studies of brain impairment are conducted with monkeys raised in isolation. Dr. Robert Heath has implanted electrodes, which cause no pain, in the brains of these monkeys. Normal brain waves show up on a graph as consistent patterns, while abnormalities produce wide fluctuations, high-voltage electrical discharges, called spiking by scientists. Dr. Heath found such abnormalities in brainwave graphs of human schizophrenics. When the brainwaves of some of Dr. Harlow's old mother-deprived monkeys were measured, they also indicated visible spiking in both the cerebellum and the septum.
And I remember my conversation with Dr. Bob Heath, and he knew or understood that he would expect to find some abnormalities in the limbic system, but the cerebellum, he thought I was whistling Dixie, I think. But he went ahead and conducted those studies because this was done as a part of a contract of research that I had established with Dr. Salzberg and Dr. Heath with the NICHD to explore these problems. And lo and behold, he found neuropathology of abnormal electrophysiological activity in these two brain structural systems. This really turned Dr. Heath's lab around, where he started then mapping out extensive connections between the cerebellum and the limbic system, and then also, of course, the frontal cortex and prefrontal areas, which is also intimately linked with the regulation of emotional behavior and affect and higher consciousness and so forth. So I proposed this neurofunctional system of linkage between the cerebellum, the limbic system, and the frontal cortex and prefrontal cortex areas. And then there were other studies that documented the structural damage to these brain areas, the somatosensory cortex and the cerebellum, in the isolation-reared animals. But then, having established that neurobiological foundation, it became imperative to demonstrate that indeed these same relationships exist in human populations. And so the question I said, what's the best strategy to really document this on really a broad scale? I mean, one could look at clinical studies, developmental studies, but they are always highly select samples. You cannot generalize too far with them, and they're very costly. So I thought that a better approach would be to look at large human populations, cultures, going back to the primitive cultures, the pre-industrial cultures, that certainly one would think that there were cultures that varied on this one specific variable of how they reared their children. And so, fortunately, a member of our National Advisory Council at that time was Professor John Whiting, who was a professor of cultural anthropology at Harvard University, who published extensively on child rearing practices and later behavior. And I remember asking John, was there a systematic database on this? And he says, well, as a matter of fact, there is, and if it exists, you'll find it in R.B. Texter's volume, A Cross-Cultural Summary, which had just come out and published in 1967, which is a massive statistical summary of the statistical correlations or interrelationships among a large number of variables that had been developed and quantified by cultural anthropologists on 400 cultures. This was the sample in Texter's essentially cross-cultural summary. And so I selected, unfortunately, there was information on child rearing practices, specifically related to whether infants were carried on the body of the mother all day long and those that did not. And those ratings were done by cultural anthropologists, Drs. Berry, Bacon, and Chow. And fortunately, there was also information on violence. And those were the two that I wanted to link up with. And Dr. Philip Slater had developed codes on violence and warfare. And so when I combined those two measures, I selected every culture in that 400 culture sample in which those two bits of information were available. And that yielded 49 cultures. And lo and behold, what I found is that 73% of the cultures could be accurately predicted or classified in terms of their peaceful or violent behavior from this one single measure of whether the infant was carried on the body of its mother all day long. And that measure was increased in predictability when I published that in 1975 in the Futurist, Body Pleasure and Origins of Violence, and it was reprinted in Bulletin of Atomic Scientists and a number of other places. And then I was informed that by 3 different cultural anthropologists that there were errors in the original coding. But every time a correction was made, it increased the predictability, so that I could now predict with 80% accuracy the violent or peaceful nature of these cultures from that one variable of maternal-infant physical affection, the bonding that occurs with this body contact. And then the second half of the story, where I could predict the remaining 20%, has to do with whether the cultures permit or punish adolescent sexuality. And basically the cultures that are very repressive towards sexual expression, what I call sexual affectional bonding, are very violent cultures, and the cultures that permit adolescent sexual expression are nonviolent cultures. So that when you combine the two of issues, the two variables of affectional bonding, the maternal-infant relationship, and then adolescent sexual relationship, I can accurately predict with 100% accuracy the peaceful or violent nature of these 49 primitive cultures distributed throughout the world. Now, there is no other theory or database that exists that can match that. And I can specify the sensory systems of the body that involve, the brain mechanisms involved, and that's why these cross-cultural studies were so successful, because they were built on solid experimental scientific evidence. When we look at the other consequences of this kind of sensory deprivation of touch and body movement, what we see in the animals and in humans, the human primate, is an aversion to touch. There is a hypersensitivity and hyperreactivity to touch, so that a very light touch stimulus will be sufficient to provoke an extreme violent response. Okay. In the animals, they cannot engage in this kind of light touching behavior, or what is called grooming behavior, where animals spend a lot of their time just touching each other and pecking through the fur for lice or whatever, but they're just touching each other, grooming. It's a dominant social activity in these animals. That behavior is destroyed. And it's a major socialization in these primates as well as in the human. And when we are socialized through touch, either through pleasure or through pain. So the pleasure system, which comes with light touch and grooming, massage, however you want to describe it, is damaged. Now, something else happens. The sensory system that mediates pain is also damaged. So what they've discovered in the experimental animals is that there is a heightened threshold to painful stimuli. There's impaired pain perception. So that the animals will engage in self-mutilation without any apparent feeling of pain. So we see this translated at the human level, where there's an increased tolerance for painful stimuli. So here we have all the ingredients necessary for accounting for why the affectionately deprived individual grows up to be so not only asocial but antisocial, because the two major socialization systems, pain and pleasure, have been rendered dysfunctional. And I've seen this documented in studies by pediatricians and developmental psychologists who relayed to me how children who are abused and neglected, or children who have been subjected to this kind of sensory deprivation for medical reasons like pediatric immobilization, plaster casts, broken limbs, and they have to be immobilized, that these children would come back to their attention years later as being hyperactive and hyperreactive. The parents, in trying to control them, would spank them, but they would report they don't seem to feel it, you know. And in fact, that was a point I made to one of them when they were talking about these children, and I says, they really had not mentioned to me the impaired pain perception, and I says, I would predict that these children also don't experience pain normally. And they said, how did you know that? he says, in fact, the parents tell us, that they spanked them and it doesn't seem to have any effect. And then I described to them the experimental animal studies, which they were not familiar with. So that has major implications for understanding the juvenile delinquency, I think the gang phenomena, the explosive violence, the need for sensory stimulation. You see, this is the other thing, that there's this chronic stimulus-seeking behavior that underlies these behaviors, because there's a need for body contact, for body stimulation. And the deprived animal organism will get it one way or the other. They'll either touch for pleasure or they'll touch for pain, but they've got to be touched. There's got to be body contact. Another dimension of this problem, which has been a major concern to me, is the relationship of these sensory neurobiological or neuropsychological events to the moral value systems of our culture or society. And what I think I have provided in my theory is a bridge between the basic sciences of developmental neurobiology and neuropsychology with moral philosophy and moral theology. And I don't know of anyone else who's been able to accomplish this. But I think I've been able to do that. And that bridge happens to be the sensory modalities or systems of pain and pleasure. And moral philosophy and moral theology has a lot to say about pain and pleasure. And we can go back to the Old Testament and we can see prescriptions for physical pain as discipline, building strong moral character. We have Proverbs 23, verses 13, 14, withhold not correction from the child, beat him with a rod, and he shall not die, beat him with a rod, and he shall save his soul from hell. And anyone who was brought up in the Western Judeo-Christian religious tradition knows that history, that pain, suffering, deprivation, or moral virtues is the path to salvation. And the opposite is also true, that body pleasure, and particularly sexual pleasure, is evil, immoral, sinful, and will lead to damnation. So here we have, in the cultures of Western civilization, in fact it's any human culture that holds to that kind of belief system, that kind of dualism between, quote, body and soul, in which the body is held as evil, source of wickedness, and the soul, disembodied soul, the spirit, is good, leads to this inevitable war against the body, because the body is the source of sin and evil and wickedness. That means body pleasure. Extraordinary, what I call pathological metaphysical dualism that has split us in two. And the ancient Greek philosophers are responsible for this gift to us, which in fact is the seeds of our own violence and destruction. It carries with it also an animosity toward women, because women has been equated essentially with the principle of the body or matter, and the male with spirit or goodness or godlike. And that came from Pythagoras. So he set it up by definition, so that women have always been unequal to men, have always been inferior, and morally so. In Ecclesiasticus 25:24, from woman came the beginning of sin, and through her we all die. And we know this throughout literature, and not just the biblical literature, but also all of our other literature. Women is the source of sin and wickedness, and particularly sexual sin. And so this has alienated man from woman and her body, and her sexuality and her sensuality. And that, of course, deprives us of the real union between male and female. Trying to explain the ultimate significance of gender inequality and the sexuality, and why men have created what we call the patriarchal theistic cultures, is designed to control the sexual body of women. And the question is, why is that? The reason, in my view, is that sexual, affectional pleasure and bonding, if it really occurs between man and woman, neutralizes power in that relationship. And so what is an issue in all of this is power. Men do not want to give up their power in society, and particularly power over women and her body and her children. And so that means you have to control and deny and repress sexual affection and pleasure. Because in the cross-cultural studies, it becomes very clear that the cultures that permit premarital sex and even extramarital sex are nonviolent cultures. They are egalitarian cultures. Women are equal to men. You don't find slavery being practiced. You don't find bride prices being present. So that what we have at issue here then is essentially the equality of women with men. And men do not want that. That is the patriarchal theistic men who want to maintain their power and control. There are many different studies I've done to address this relationship. And one of the ones I've been active in the abortion issue, trying to resolve the dilemma, is abortion murder or is it a compassionate act not to bring unwanted life into this world? Now, it's very clear that this cannot be resolved on philosophical or moral theological grounds. I mean, you either believe what you believe or you don't, and that's it. So the question I raised was, well, let's answer this question in terms of empirical data. And it would seem logical that if the act of abortion was murder, then the cultures that permit abortion should be murderous type cultures. And therefore, we should look at their other social behaviors to see whether there, in fact, is evidence to support that. So that's what I did. And lo and behold, what I found is that, in fact, the cultures that permit abortion are the nonviolent cultures. The cultures that punish abortion are the very violent cultures, authoritarian, that practice slavery. Women are unequal. So the abortion issue is really reflecting the dimension of men's control over a woman's body and her sexual body. Okay. But I wanted again to test it out on contemporary modern cultures. That was primitive culture data. So I examined the voting records in the United States Congress, also the Canadian Federal Parliament, which I began, but the results were identical. And I examined it both in the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives. So I looked at how congressmen voted on the abortion issue and how they voted on capital punishment. Now, if being opposed to abortion reflects a right to life principle, then it would be logical to say they would be opposed to capital punishment. So when I examined that data, it turned out just the opposite. That those who were opposed to the abortion rights of women were the strongest supporters of capital punishment. But I wanted to go beyond that and say, well, this is a general characteristic. So I looked at other votes involving support of the war in Vietnam, handgun control legislation, supporting Nixon's no-knock laws, all the violent, oppressive, controlling legislation of human rights and freedom. And the pattern was consistent. The anti-abortion senators and congressmen were the ones who supported capital punishment, supported the continuing the war in Vietnam, opposed gun control legislation, supported Nixon's no-knock laws. And the opposite relationship, of course, was true for those who supported abortion rights. Now, there was another ingredient in here which I wanted to sort of tie up the package, and that goes back to nurturance. All this relates to nurturance and bonding. The National Farmers Union Party has rates congressmen on how well they support the farm family and the farm bills, many of them which include school lunch and milk lunch programs for children. And so they rate the congressmen on how well they support these kinds of programs, which I call family nurturance score. And it's rated from 0 to 100, just like the Americans for Democratic Action and Republicans rank them in terms of their political conservatism and liberalism. So I wanted to see what kind of nurturance score they had. And lo and behold, I found that the congressmen who opposed abortion rights of women, supported capital punishment, had half the nurturance score of the congressman who supported the right of abortion, opposed capital punishment. In fact, the average family nurturance score was something like 98 out of 100. And it was about half of that, about 48 in the other group. And that was a very consistent pattern. It's the same pattern of relationships that we saw in the cross-cultural data in the primitive cultures. And it's what it reflects is a basic reciprocal relationship between pain and pleasure. If you're into pleasure and affectional bonding and caring and compassion, you're not into the pain and the violence and controlling and authoritarianism. And that's why I've concluded that physical pleasure mutually shared in the human relationship neutralizes power in that relationship. And so if we were truly going to achieve an egalitarian, humanitarian culture where women are truly equal to men, we have to reestablish the affectional bonding between mother and infant and the expressive sexuality of adolescence and also adulthood. And that is why we see in the fundamentalist Christian right, the Roman Catholic Church, that the preoccupation, for the most part, is with issues of sexuality, not with the relationship of man with God, which is what they ought to be addressing, but they're always have their major focus on controlling and regulating sexual behavior. They're preoccupied with it because they know that if they admit, to the open and free choice of sexual expression, it destroys the authoritarian, fascist, power-driven cultures.